while watching a few episodes of a program called Love on the Spectrum, which is about autistic people being introduced to one another with the potential of going out on a date. And I avoided watching it for a bit because the cover looks like The Bachelor.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not into that. I was worried about people being used just for entertainment on a dating platform. But my husband has worked with people with special needs, Down syndrome, people on the autism spectrum. And he wanted to see if that's what it was, or if it was something that was more genuine. And I was not thinking that that's where it was going to go. They had several women on the show. And I turned to James and I said, do all the participants have autism? He said, yes. I said, this woman has autism? Because the woman is just like, I think she was more socially capable than me on a good day. She, was very charming and witty and quick, and her language was amazing, and, great eye contact. All these things that I don't think of as being someone that's been diagnosed with autism. I don't think of that as being something that you're capable of doing. He said, oh, no, actually, she talks about that. What? She talks about what? Being a woman and being diagnosed with autism. Apparently, there's this huge disparity. Men are 3 or 4 times more likely to be diagnosed with autism than women are, but it isn't necessarily because it's less common among women. And so that's the topic that I want to discuss with you today.
It's a good topic.
Oh man, it's fairly, I don't want to say it's new, but the known case studies, known researchers, it's all fairly new. I would say maybe only going back about as far as 2018, where I'm starting to see female authors of studies, diagnosticians, that in many cases, with what I read, it's women who are diagnosed later in life. When we talk about diagnosing people as autistic, usually I'm thinking about grade school.
Mm-hmm.
When you get diagnosed, it's usually in grade school. So teachers are given a certain toolkit of things to look out for. And I don't think of adult diagnosis of autism because, anyone who's gone to the public school system, haven't we already kind of sussed that out? And the answer is no, not in the case of women.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the case of girls. And so a lot of women that are diagnosed much later than grade school. I'm saying they get through college, they've had a career, and they get into 40s, 50s. And one of the women described it as she had autistic burnout. And what she meant by autistic burnout is the veiling of the symptoms that they personally have with autism, that as an outsider, you don't even know that necessarily they're having any kind of a struggle at all. And that's the definition of veiling, is that what's going on the outside is not matching what your internal feelings and internal dialogue are. Veiling sounds like it's part of the entire human spectrum. I definitely identify with where my inside behavior and dialogue does not match what my external physical behavior, vocal behavior, and otherwise recognizable behaviors are. But this burnout it takes a ton of energy to mask in order to try to fit what you believe is normal around you. Whatever that means for the given scenario that you're in, it takes a lot of physical energy, it takes mental energy, and it takes emotional energy, even if it's subconscious that you're doing it. So let's talk about younger girls in the classroom setting. I just want to ask, and it's not to put you on the spot, to more like suss out what our kind of cliche, run-of-the-mill knowledge of autistic behaviors in children's might be. What would you look for in a classroom to try to see if maybe one of the students is having a difficult time and should be looked at to see if they are maybe autistic?
Well, if I were an educator and if I were in a position where I'm assessing my students, and then I notice some children are inherently just withdrawn, they don't readily communicate, probably because they're processing information much differently than everybody else. They're also handling stimuli much differently than everybody else. And these students tend to come across as somebody who might have like a delay of some sort, whether it's with speech or it could be an inability to read something. It could be very slow to maybe write something. Doesn't mean that anything is wrong with this child at all. It's just that their disposition and how they process is differently. So there may be something more to it. This child might be on the spectrum. And I only say that because my son had a speech delay. And he's on the spectrum. He had mixed expressive receptive speech disorder, where he
It's a title.
Yeah, he would hear you, he would understand you, but he didn't know how to communicate what he was thinking and feeling. He knew how to somehow, but there was just some kind of like inability for it to make its way out of his body. The information was there. He was just so intensely frustrated. So we noticed there was something going on when he was nearing the age of 2 and he wasn't saying much, or he was just pointing, grunting, So we had him assessed, and then he ultimately was diagnosed with this. So we received an early intervention. So he was in therapy for a year, speech therapy. His speech therapist was amazing, and occupational therapy. So he would get used to his body and environments, certain sensations, tactile things, playing with certain things. We had to teach him some sign language in order for him to ask for things. So if he was hungry, if he was thirsty, if he wasn't feeling well, if he was tired, just very basic things. So we had to teach him that. And when he was able to get that point across, things started to get better for him. And I don't want to say things started to improve, because you know what? Nothing was bad to begin with.
No, nothing was bad. But he felt relieved that he could communicate his needs more readily.
Yeah, he could.
So you feel like it was really good that he got some kind of a diagnosis with some sort of assistance to make it so that he was not under stress.
After he went through preschool and he was interacting with other kids and watching what they were doing, and then gradually was able to pick up on all of the social cues and everything else. Usually kids who are diagnosed with this, and then if they don't readily get the assistance that they need in order for them to accommodate it,
coping assistance,
will have problems later on in life with reading, socializing with other kids, not understanding what people are saying. There's such an array of dispositions, as I like to call them, that are on the spectrum that are all unique. And I've watched Love on the Spectrum. I actually watched both seasons of it because I was fascinated by it. In fact, I mean, there were a lot of things that I could actually relate to just from my own standpoint. My son's condition at that time, I was told it's an inherited one. He certainly inherited it from me, only because when I look back on my life, especially when I was like in first, second, and third grade, I had a really difficult time. Actually, reading was a really hard thing for me to do. Well, I had an older sister who was a voracious reader, and here I was trying to take it upon myself to do the same thing, and I just, for some reason, wasn't getting it. And it was just seeing the information, not really understanding. They would tell you the sound, they would show you what to do, but there was some kind of a disconnect. And everything from like, oh, you need glasses, oh, you're just hyperactive, oh, I mean, there were all of these things. And it wasn't until probably the 6th grade where I figured out a way to do it. The reading came, but I'm a very, very slow reader, but I retain everything.
Mm-hmm.
I love watching films that kind of like made up for a lot of what I was feeling like I was lacking as a child. Movies definitely made up for it. Yeah.
Did you feel like it interfered with your basic schooling? Because we do a lot of reading at school.
It did it up until middle school, and in high school, I was an A-B student. student in most subjects. I had a hard time if I had to read through like heavy literature, and I got through it, but I had to work twice as hard, maybe harder than everybody else in the classroom. And I noticed it, and I was very self-aware.
Was there a negative feeling associated with that extra amount of work that you had to do?
Always. I felt like I didn't match up.
So you felt under pressure to meet expectations.
Yep. The payoff wasn't until I got into college where I could sit and listen to a professor rattle. And then I was like, I got it. I get it. Just writing everything down, taking notes.
So listening and writing, you retain information faster and better.
Yep.
Aha.
Yep.
Well, so I want to go back to grade school, young children in the classroom. Some of the kind of the toolbox that I mentioned for early diagnostics is, like you were saying, not assimilating to the rest of the classroom. So if children are separating themselves physically from their peers and playing alone regularly and isolating, that is one of the number one symptoms. Also, another very well-known behavior that might call attention is if a student is having a difficult time and they have what could be construed as a negative outburst. If they're having outbursts during class when other students are able to sit quietly, if students aren't able to have what is called quiet hands. So if you have disquieted hands, you're moving your hands, you're fidgeting, you're touching, you're wiggling. That's a form of stimming. I've heard it pronounced stemming, and I've heard it pronounced stimming. It's spelled with an I, so I will say stimming. That there's a physical movement associated with focusing. So if you're listening to someone, you're fidgeting, you're moving, you're rocking, or there's a lot of like leg bobbing and hand wringing, that sort of a thing. But it can be a lot more than that. There are more physical movement aspects that can be augmented, and even more like jumping up and down, and bigger movements. But sometimes they're just very small movements. But in the classroom, one is always asked to be still, quiet, focused, listening, respectful. And if those words feel like they're interrupted, so it's not being respectful, not being quiet, not being still, not being focused, then there's a question of, on that spectrum of, okay, kids have energy, they're growing, they get bored, but is that pushing into a less common and disruptive area? And so then it will be investigated. But with girls in the classroom, the symptoms aren't usually that big. Girls tend to learn really early on, even in a subconscious way, to incorporate other people's movements, their quote normal gestural items. They persistently try to be a part of the group of girls playing. So even if they're repeatedly rejected, they tend to try to circle back in. Meanwhile, their male counterparts in the classroom will often go do something by themselves instead of trying to play with other kids. The girls tend to internalize more of their upset that you were talking about, of not feeling like they're keeping up, of not feeling like they're being accepted, of not feeling, quote, normal. And that pressure that comes with needing to fit in, needing to keep up, needing to be a part of things. And it would often be more depression, anxiety, internalized symptoms. So this is sounding like this is resonating. Are you diagnosed as autistic?
I'm not. And I feel like, put it this way, when we're sitting there and we're watching this program and, you have your different individuals on Love on the Spectrum kind of talking to the camera about how things need to be for them and how they have a hard time with this and how they have a hard time with that and how they're trying to accommodate this. And, my husband kept looking over at me and just kind of, nodding his head. So he certainly feels that I'm different, not in a bad way.
No, it's like what you were saying, which is just that you are coming at information and processing differently, at different lengths of time.
Mm-hmm. I process differently.
And that there's nothing wrong other than the extra pressure to conform to a different length of time and being responsive in a different length of time and in a different way. Mm-hmm. I'm not ever feeling like, you have these gross misunderstandings or,
oh no,
that you're incapable. It's And I think that's another stigma.
Yeah.
So actually there was a study that suggested that basically they referred to autism as the extreme male brain. This is their hypothesis here is based on the theory that men are more systemizers than women who are more empathizers. Meanwhile, people who are diagnosed as autistic are going to be less empathizers and more systemizers. But that basically, if you are a human with autism, you're going to lack empathy as compared to the control group, and you're going to be more involved in and excel within systems, which is being interested in patterns, being able to spot patterns in nature, mathematics, mechanical systems, you name it. But that's like I have friction with that.
I do too.
And a lot of the scientific community had friction with this too, saying like, well, your study group isn't even really appropriately evaluated because your study group is a self-assessed study group, which is excluding like a huge number of people who have any kind of a social discomfort. They're not even going to come into this social group and be able to self-assess as a whole other thing. You get a lot of errors with self-assessing when you're collecting information, but you're the one evaluating your own information. A lot of errors occur. And then there's just this basic argument. People who have autism, there is in no way a lack of empathy with these human beings. It's that they take often longer to process what's coming at them. And they're working so hard to process what's coming at them that the amount of energy it takes and the amount of time it takes to have a response, especially if they're hoping, if they're trying to have what they believe is an appropriate response, if they're doing any amount of masking to ensure that what they're giving back is as clean and as gentle as possible. That takes a ton of time and energy for them. So this is like not a realistic basis of information for a lot of people who have responded to that one study. So, I have a hard time with what is the most appropriate language around issues like this, because number one, diagnosing autism is not in order for the person to hold a card that says they have a disorder. That you're predisposed to an illness. Like, I don't want to call it a disorder, an illness, or it's like you said, it's not a problem unless it's a problem. It's more for that person who has autism to be able to have the extra time needed, to have the extra energy needed. And it's basically just a permission. We recognize, the control group, recognize that you need this because you have this disorder, right? But I don't like the negative connotation of the language. That's still a very othering term, which is assuming that there's a control group, which is, quote, normal. So I just want to clarify that I feel like I don't have a lexicon that's non-villainizing in some way.
Right.
And so I apologize ahead of time. I don't know that the language exists. This isn't really ahead of time either. This is kind of mid-gate. But I just want to say, like, if I'm not using the best language possible, I just apologize. I'm just doing the best that I can with the words that I have in the moment. Fixation. Fixation is another well-known. If you have a conversation with someone that you know is autistic, especially if they're a student, they're going to start talking to you about dinosaurs or trains, having all US presidents memorized, and they know that topic inside and out. Those are very, very common aspects of being autistic, is that you get very fixated and interested and passionate on a singular topic. When it comes to men versus women that have been diagnosed, what can generally be stated is that women tend to gravitate toward topics that have some sort of group appeal. Often they're very passionate and interested in animals or in pop icons or music. I would say that that's very common. And that's also indicative of empathy. I think if you're very interested in living creatures and you love them, that's a ton of empathy right there. If you're interested in music, that's so emotional, which I think is just this huge flag stating like, hello, if you ever thought that people with autism lack empathy, like this is just not true.
I mean, they're varying degrees.
It is a spectrum.
It is. But there's a dark side to it, because being able to socialize or understanding social cues, and when you don't understand it, especially when you're in your tweens and into your teens and other kids are talking to you or they're talking at you and you can't respond, and then your parents just say, oh, she's shy. and
Oh, yeah.
that was, when I was 12, 13, like into freshman year, that was something that was a problem.
Well, the reason that a lot of girls turn shy during that age is because there's so much pressure to exist a certain way.
Yeah.
And if you feel like you cannot exist in that way, like just avoid the possibility of confrontation at that point. I totally get that.
Yeah. And even, I look in my 20s, even, it's like, is this person being sincere? And so you feel isolated because sometimes you can't pick up on the intention of another human being.
But you kind of have to take them at face value, right? You have to take people at face value when they say something to you. But what I feel like is that there's this uncertainty on the inside that makes your whole gut feel frigid, right? You're
Right.
like, is it real? Like, are they being nice? Are they actually being the opposite of nice right now? Are they making fun of me?
So you just retreat. You tend to gravitate to other people who have similar characteristics that you do. And so as a kid, I liked hanging out with other little kids who were really into the things that they were doing because I could sit and be with them. I would listen to them talk and I would learn something. And then I felt like, okay, I feel like I can contribute to my own life maybe by just getting into something. And so, I had my varying interests, which I'm still interested in, even at this age, in a very childlike manner, still. And I can't get through my day unless I'm able to take it in the way I took it in when I was like 5 years old. And it's all music driven. But and the enjoyment side of it, just listening to it, processing and listening and hearing and listening and thinking and listening. And
having space to process, I think, is huge. There are so many more people than we're aware of, including you, that need to have this permission to take the space required, and that it is not stupidity. It's not, a lack of engagement. It's not laziness. It's needing the space for the whole bit of information to cycle through. And one of the things that I think we really like in our society, that we really respect, is when people are fast, right? That they're fast to be angry, passionate, witty.
Oh, yeah.
And that they're just so immediately responsive. And when we're watching anything that's scripted, that's done well, I think that suspension of disbelief is there, right? Where we truly believe, oh, this person is so much smarter than me. They're so much faster than me. They're so much better than me. This is the ideal that we're all needing to try to live up to, right? Is thinking on your feet. If somebody puts you on the spot and says something that questions your behavior, your identity, your choices, and they put you on the spot to answer in that moment, and you can't just do it with eloquence, elegance, grace.
Not at a young age. Yeah.
I want to say, even as an adult, in that scenario, if someone puts you on the spot and you can't answer with gracefully right away, then it's like, oh, well, then you don't know what you're talking about, or you don't deserve attention, or you don't really know.
You get steamrolled.
I think that true communication is allowing information at the pace that it needs to come without this feeling that, oh, I silenced the other person or turned them to my side. Like, that's not how real communication works. So I guess I didn't finish this thought before, but with these young children, with the girls gravitating toward what are more kind of societally accepted topics of interest, the boys tend to veer off and get really, really specialized, more unique interests. And it's more isolating, like you said. But women who are on the autistic spectrum tend to still want to be part of that whole. They don't want to float off as a loose electron. And so it's not as easy to spot from the outside that there's this difficulty going on, because they're masking and accommodating. They need to have a channel of extreme interest. There's a drive that's there. But so they go, oh, so-and-so likes kittens. I'm going to learn about kittens. And then I'll have kitten stickers and kitten books and kitten notebooks and, just everything with the cats. So I guess what I'm saying is that the male counterparts tend to have niche interests, and girls and women tend to have more common or mainstream interests when it comes to those fixation points of interest.
What bothered me about Love on the Spectrum,
yes,
and just knowing how easy it is for someone who is autistic to obsess over something. And here we are with both men and women, and I can see it, obsessing over their need to be with somebody.
Yeah.
And the thing is, what made me sad is that, they have their support groups, loving families, etc. And, that's great. Everybody needs and wants somebody, but to obsess on it to the degree in which some of these individuals did made me sad, because I know that there's more to it, and they're isolating themselves. They're feeling lonely. It's almost like it's the end all be all. I've got to find somebody, and they know how they are. Like, their life isn't complete. And rather than the support being, not everybody finds somebody, and it's okay to just kind of live your life, and you don't have to obsess so much. But it's a slippery slope. And I think there's more or less, I feel bad, but I feel like these people are probably in more pain and sadness than they let on.
Yeah.
Because they can't satiate their need to complete the process, which is a very intense thing. Once you start something, you need to finish it. For somebody who's autistic, it's like, okay, I started this, I need to finish it. It needs to get done. And there's no resolution, and it just drags on. And there are people in the second season who are also in the first season, and it's still, they're still trying so hard.
And it's like they're being very sportsmanlike about it, where they're like, we gotta get back on the horse, get back in the saddle.
So much grace, so much kindness, so much love, like just very loving people, tremendous amount of empathy, understanding what sadness is, understanding what loneliness is, and knowing if somebody else is feeling that way. It's just like, I'm so sorry. And that's what you see. And these are all highly functioning people.
For anyone who doesn't know why we're using the phrase high functioning, it means the expectations in society of driving from here to there and having a social engagement or a job, having a pet, maybe being able to care for another creature, self-care. If you're high functioning, the self-care, you can wash your hair, you can take your showers, you can dress yourself. There's not always a physical component that goes with autism, but autism symptoms are correlated to certain physically identifiable symptoms as well. But it isn't that they necessarily have to go together. So as far as sensory overload goes, which is part of neurological processing, physical processing with being autistic, is that there can be a degree of overwhelm where it's not safe for them to drive, because they will not be able to respond to all normal scenarios on the road. A lesser functioning individual may need more emotional support or physical support, or they might need to have someone drive them. They might need to have a chaperone. I read an article called The Lost Girls, and I just want everyone to read this. It really touched me. The woman in it said that she went through, I think she was diagnosed in her 50s. She spent her whole life feeling so stressed and having ultimately a breakdown, that feeling of burnout, that feeling of how much emotional, physical, and mental energy it takes to try to cope with those everyday stimuli that most people seem to just be breezing through and not feeling like you can breeze through it. And that there is not an immediate explosion that happens. It's not until years down the line where she could not cope anymore. She'd gone to many diagnosticians, many specialists, and was diagnosed with an array of things that did not seem to apply. And the problem with that being that if you don't feel like everything's okay for you, you're looking around you and going, everybody else seems to be doing this faster, calmer. They're not as tired as I am. Something is going on. I want to know what it is. And if you're given 6 different possible diagnoses that are completely different from one another, you might as well just choose one.
Right.
But none of them are the real one. If you don't feel like any of those are real, like I think one person said she had borderline personality disorder. How helpful is that for her? Not helpful at all. And then finally, someone saying, I believe that you're autistic. Let's examine that. And she felt like because there is this feeling of sudden, like you can forgive yourself. You can give yourself permission to take the space you need, or of course you're tired. Look at all the work you've been doing. But we're not allowed to talk about that work because other people aren't doing that work. That's hidden work that you're doing on the inside, which doesn't mean it's not happening, but we're like constantly invalidating it in order to get through what is deemed as a normal day. You have a normal job just like everyone else. Why can't you do the work that everyone else is doing? What's wrong with you is the first, thought that comes to mind. You can't sit through the class? What's wrong with you? There's nothing wrong necessarily, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a need for more coping tools. And so one would say, well, if you can get through your school years, if you can get through college, if you can get a job, then there's no real problem. So why are you worried about getting a diagnosis? Well, because a lot of these women said that when they got into their 40s and 50s, they have like basically a nervous breakdown. And these women said, I feel like I'm a fake friend because I'm saying things that I believe need to be said in order for people to feel good and feel friendly, but they're not necessarily how I'm actually feeling. And I've done it so much that I don't really know who I am anymore. I feel like I'm covering myself up with these layers that aren't me. And now I don't feel like there is a me. I'm buried in masks and masquerading as what I think is normal, but I don't feel like I match that.
Right. And that's really sad because it's just, again, it's that societal expectation on how a person needs to be and needs to exist. And some people just have a way about them where it doesn't need to be that way for them. My daughter's school is actually catching on where at the school they've reserved a quiet room.
Oh.
Where if they're in the classroom, if they feel like in a moment that it's just too much for them, if they're having a hard time with anything, they can stop what they're doing. They can leave and just be like, let the teacher know I'm going to go to the quiet room. And they're allowed to go. They're excused. And then they go into the room, they check in. There's always a counselor available until they're able, feel like they're ready to go back again.
That's amazing.
But whether you're on the spectrum or not,
you're allowed to get overwhelmed.
Right. Being a student, it's a stressful, overwhelming environment for anybody. They can raise their hand. May I be excused? Yes. Knowing that they have this security of going somewhere where they can gather themselves. No one's going to judge. And then they can come back again, only to be more productive.
Yes. And that this accommodation is aiming at an ultimate higher level of productivity. Empathy and communication are key. If there's a knee-jerk reaction of feeling like, well, why are other person's needs being met? What about my needs? Then maybe there's something going on, but there isn't this specific diagnosis for you that gives you permission to have what you need. And then there's also then an entitlement feeling where you just feel entitled to be like, well, I want someone to cater to me. Well, how difficult a time are you having? And that is not a numerical gauge that we can know. And there's that feeling of isolation that doesn't just come with, oh, I look different, but that there are these kind of silent killers, these silent mores and social behaviors that dictate that we don't have to be concerned about you. We have to be concerned about all this other stuff. And so there's at least double layer of difficulty with this, with women and young girls being able to be diagnosed with autism and then having access to support and coping tools. This is what I'm after here. I cannot stress this enough. Most of these women who were diagnosed later in life said, yeah, it really would have been nice to have known sooner, because then I would have hopefully had access to support. I would have had access to coping tools. And my parents maybe would have not just thought I was being difficult on purpose. And that sometimes girls are covering up their symptoms so well. They're camouflaging so well that diagnosticians miss it, teachers miss it, parents miss it. And I'm sure that there are plenty of people that go, well, then why, there's no problem. If all these people are missing it, then there's no problem. Until later in life, when this person is trying to hold down a job, is trying to have a family, is trying their hardest, and that it's not enough, and that they are feeling like they're going to fall through the cracks, and that it becomes a physical endangerment issue. There was one study that was done that strongly correlated anorexia with autism in girls. Young girls that were hospitalized for anorexia had symptoms of autism, whether they were diagnosed or not. So there is an endangerment because of the social pressures. A lot of it is social pressure. That if you feel like you're not up to snuff and you become anxious and depressed, there's self-harm, there's that you don't eat, that you become depressed and suicidal. I mean, this is not a joke. It's not that it's that person's choice.
Right. It's almost as if the habitat does not suit the animal. So there needs to be more things in place so people can feel like they can retreat, and they just need to somehow recharge their batteries differently than other people. The self-harm part is especially sad because you know that there are children out there and young adults out there and just people even older who still feel like they're a lost cause and that they'll never be able to fit in, and they're not being acknowledged, or they just can't acknowledge it themselves, or there's just so much to it. They just decide to opt out altogether and they take their own lives,
Options and permissions being kind of the focus words, and even such a huge concept as that. If you feel like you have no option, it becomes a binary feeling in your mind of, I can't succeed. If I can't be alive and succeed, then I'm failing. Why am I alive? That's a really scary logic, that when you are really, really fatigued, that strange, demented logic emerges. I know personally that extreme fatigue and nervous breakdown, that becomes the question, is like, am I living? Am I even alive? Should I be alive if I'm not able to live, if I'm not able to be okay in my body, and I don't feel like I'm helping in the world? It starts to feel like there's no other option. And I do not want to cling to that topic any longer than I need to. I'm going to circle back to basically saying, even in modern times, even right now, like this year, even though it's in flux, it's changing, fewer women are diagnosed. But the question is, are there fewer women with autism, or is it just harder to diagnose? Diagnosticians are also saying, women are too complex. Girls are too complex to diagnose it. You can't diagnose it. Well, if you can't diagnose it, if women are so complex with their changing chemistry and their social behaviors and all of these layers of things that make a person, how do we diagnose anything? I mean, this woman that I was talking about that was diagnosed in her 50s, being given diagnoses of borderline personality disorder, one of the main points of being diagnosed with anything is to get help with it, to make it so that your life is more livable, and so that you can cope, so that you can participate in society and you can participate in your own life and not become so deeply isolated that you're not participating in society and that you're not even participating in your own personal life enjoyment. But that one of the things that I believe she said, and it sounded like a few of the other women also had this sentiment, is that they wish that they had been diagnosed sooner, but at the same time they worry that if they had been offered this diagnosis and they've been offered assistance, that they would not have achieved as much as they did trying to fit the bill. And so inherently, what I'm hearing with these women is that there's this guilt associated with, well, I don't want to be lazy. I want to succeed. I deeply, deeply want to succeed in my life, with my family, in the workplace, in the school, socially, with my friends. I deeply wish to be a part of it and be successful. And I'm worried that if someone told me, oh, well, you have autism, that they would not try as hard and that they would be forgiven so much that they wouldn't even achieve as much. And I think that is the mentality of many people who are struggling. There's something very emotional tied into that mentality of feeling like, if anyone offers me any amount of mercy, then maybe I'll stop trying, and that will be a failure in and of itself.
The mercy aspect needs to come in hand with encouragement. It's almost like just acknowledging that, yeah, you've got something going on, but it doesn't mean you can't achieve, because you're doing great. Look at you.
Why is it that people are so prideful about not needing help and being able to do everything on their own, when humans really are not designed physically or mentally or emotionally to be lone wolves? If we're not looking for a partner or a family, then we're looking for a clique or a job or a community in some way validating that we exist and that we are a part of something that has momentum, that is right to us, that is good to us, that is successful to us. And that validation can only come from the outside. And it's interesting because all these self-help things say, you have to decide what's right for you. You have to decide if you've pushed far enough, you can't let other people validate you or invalidate you. It's up to you. But truly, there's a very basic kind of animal part of us that requires external validation. Because like I'm saying, with these diagnoses, you feel like you've gone through your whole life. You now recognize, okay, I probably am on the spectrum. I could probably go and get diagnosed. Maybe that would not be very helpful for me at this point.
I'm fine.
I'm okay.
Yeah, I'm fine.
But also, having it recognized by an external force creates this safe space, that permissive space. If you're not allowed to say, I'm overwhelmed, I need to sit down. I'm overwhelmed, I need quiet. I'm overwhelmed, I need help. If you're not allowed to say that, then you're going to do the chicken thing, which is, oh, a fox just came and took a bite out of my side, but I can't look as though anything's wrong or the other chickens will turn on me. We have this thing, at least women do in society. Don't show that you have a weakness, or there will be predation from the inside circle.
Yeah.
That's like masking in nature to the nth degree, right? Chickens will act like everything's fine and dandy and they're missing half of their torso, and they can do it. They can do it until they drop dead. And humans can do it until they drop. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily drop dead, but until they drop. They do it until they cannot muster the ability to mask it anymore. And then the wound becomes so obvious after the person has dropped. And it's interesting because I feel like you and I have circled in on that concept of why can't we have help and empathy for issues before they turn into these massive schisms and chasms and wounds? You know, why haven't we noticed that the stitching is coming undone until it's this gaping hole?
Right, right. I feel that when a child is showing these indicators that they stand out and they're not like other children, rather than make them so self-aware to the point where they want to become a recluse, matter of fact, accept it as just being what it is and you're fine. You know, my mom would say when my son was going through this, that every grape ripes on the vine differently and at a different rate. And so that stuck with me. And he excels. He's a fantastic student. He's very astute. He gets it, you know. And I'm thankful for that. Had we not had this intervention, who knows? Another thing, and I just wanted to put this out there too, because he had gone through this program, when it came time for him to enter into public school, I received a phone call from the school district stating that he's going to go right into special needs. And I said, my son is not special needs. Now there's something. When you have these children who actually are high functioning, can exist with everybody else, do all the same things, you know, and yet they're being told based on a diagnosis of sorts that they're special needs and they need to go into a different program.
And that is why the word spectrum is so important. And that in all aspects of life right now, I'm really trying to hold spectrum at the forefront of my mind, because humans are not strictly binary in most of their existence. If you have to tell yourself this choice is right because the other choice is bad, or all other choices are bad, it's not the healthiest thinking. But I am seeing that it is a very normalized pattern of thought at this present moment in time in the region where I live, that often we're only ever presented with two options when there are infinite options. Humans only see a certain number of colors in the spectrum of light. That's fine. It's functional for us, right? But it's not how every other creature lives. So our reality is not their reality. But we're living in the same world. So isn't that what reality is? What was it? Was I watching a movie? Was I having a conversation? I don't remember, but someone said, my father held up a shape to me and I saw a square, and he held it up to my sibling and they saw a triangle. And I thought to myself, what the hell is wrong with my sibling? I know they're smart. What are they talking about? I know it's a square. And then the father reveals it's a pyramid. There's a square on bottom and triangles on the side. Instead of doubting another person and being like, what I know is right, what you know is wrong, if it doesn't match, try to come to a reality where there's a semblance there.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible that they're right and I'm right, and that we don't have any crossover that we're aware of, but it crosses over somewhere. And that's why I feel like spectrum, that's so beautiful. I love that it's part of our lexicon now. And it's not just isolated to the autistic spectrum. It is a human spectrum of success is on a spectrum. Happiness is on a spectrum. Control is on a spectrum. There is never just a right and a wrong. And that's what's so hard. It's like when you're drawing, have you ever noticed like, oh, if I only need to draw a small square, it looks very, very square. But if you take that same line that you drew and you extend it out a yard, you see, oh, that wasn't really a straight line. It's like going up. It's like now it's like a 45-degree angle. Like
I actually made a vanishing point and I didn't realize it looking the other way.
Yes, exactly. And so in those immediate scenarios, you're not seeing how askew a line is necessarily until you expand that out across the spectrum. And then you get to gauge your point in space and reality much more readily when you're accepting that kind of hawk's eye view of your life, of society, of time. You get a better cross section of where it is you're at in that moment in time. And it's really hard to backtrack and say like, oh, I had this thing happen. Is it at all correlated to this thing that happened, 2 years ago when I started to notice that I felt this way or I had this thing? And sometimes you're not ever going to get an answer. And that is the toughest thing for human beings. We want to be in the know. We want to know for a fact that things are happening or not happening. What if the still waters run deep? When you see that the top of the water is barely moving, that doesn't mean you know anything about the water underneath at all. And I'm seeing that with the misdiagnoses and misdiagnoses of women with autism, it is another reminder to me that what's going on visibly on the outside does not communicate what's necessarily going on just underneath that. I am intrigued by the idea that we assume a lot of reality is only what we can see, hear, and taste. I think those physical senses only tell us so much about our reality. And that I see that people create a smaller reality in order to create safety. So having a tight family or having a tight circle of friends or having a regular profession where you know what the environment is likely to be like when you enter it, you know that you're going to be able to endure long term in this friendship, in this family, in this job. And I think that I've naturally gravitated away from that a lot. I get uncomfortable when I feel like it's too comfortable because it's not a 360 view of reality. If I'm waking up at exactly the same time and I'm showing up at exactly the same time and I'm doing all the same tasks, it doesn't make sense anymore. It stops making sense. It's like when you say a word over and over again and you go, whoa, that word is totally dismantled now. It doesn't make sense.
Well, for the people who can't cope for whatever reason, as they're trying to figure out what it is that makes them who they are, I feel like in being a part of anyone who's a part of the spectrum and the coping mechanisms, not necessarily that there's anything bad happening, and understanding what's going on potentially in the people that you come into contact with and just how much of what they're experiencing is readable on the surface. We're all conditioned to get through, and we're all conditioned somehow to survive. And everyone's survival is as unique as it is to the person that it's attached to.
I just want to say that medically speaking, having things be gender biased is a true issue of concern. And it goes as far as knowing that these test groups were all male for a long time. The people performing, conducting the tests, doing the research were male largely. And when there is no inclusion of an othered portion of that whole spectrum, that means that information is only half as helpful as it could be. Women comprise half of the populace of the planet. So if you're leaving them out of a study about autism and you're leaving them out of a study about heart attacks, that's going to create an unsafe environment for women. So, of course, women walk through life feeling unsafe. It isn't just that we feel like we're worried that we're going to be put in an unsafe position that risks our lives immediately or risks us being raped or abused in some way. It's also that we can't go to a safe place. We can't go to a hospital or go into an ambulance and have recognized symptoms because these study groups are male dominated.
Mm-hmm.
So heart attacks present differently in women than they do in men. Autism presents differently in women than it does in men. On the whole, that doesn't mean that you can't have some of the same symptoms cross over.
Mm-hmm.
Columbia Surgery states that cardiovascular disease is often misdiagnosed as well as undertreated in women. And they add that gender-balanced research is lacking. There's a cardiologist who's also the chair of the annual symposium on women and heart disease. And she said better education in medical school, nursing school, and residency with a focus on gender discrepancies will help raise awareness that this is still happening. There is an immediate concern that if a woman is suffering, that she will be told, no, you don't have a serious problem, because the list of symptoms isn't their list of symptoms. This is invalidating. That's not on the hot list that is at the emergency room. And so women who are having heart attacks are actually turned away or misdiagnosed. And that creates a dangerous scenario of sitting on a medical problem for long enough that it does more damage, when life could really be improved with a diagnosis, a correct diagnosis. And a heart attack is certainly different than autism. But not being able to diagnose either simply because you are female is a problem. And it's not just isolated to autism and heart attacks. I'm just saying that these are two examples. Also, car safety. Did you know that most of the car safety test dummies were built for average male form?
I did know that.
And that all those crash tests up until more recently were just done with those average male forms. And then they included an average female form, but it's not even required in the driver's seat for some of the major tests. Not even in the driver's seat are they putting this female body. Like, how much more gender biased can it get? It can get a lot more gender biased. Let's just put it that simply. That'll be another episode too, I'm sure.
Sure.
I just want to say I'm also concerned that I don't want any listeners that don't identify as male or female strongly, or they're not cis male or cis female. Most of these studies that I'm reading up on, it's about cis male, cis female participants.
Mm-hmm.
Although one of the studies I read said that they also had transgender participants. That's only one. So I just want to say, right, the information isn't at my fingertips, and I'm not consciously leaving people out that have a very valid inclusion in these conversations. It's just the information is not accessible to me.
Things are off balance for sure.
Thanks for tuning in to By the Roots with hosts Nicole Berry and Corinne Meadors. Music by Mim Paquin.